Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with author and historian Ellen Hampton. She's here to talk about the reason why so many things in France, from social interactions to bureaucratic pursuits, can be so convoluted. Compliqué. Welcome, Ellen. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do here in France?
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a historian and author, and I have a book that just came out in April, a new edition of Women of Valor, the Rochambelles on the WWII Front, which is about a group of women ambulance drivers in the Second World War. It's a fairly amazing story. And I teach a little bit here and there, and otherwise I'm working on books most of the time, doing research.
Amazing. That sounds like such a great story of the Rochambelles. We'll make sure and put a link to that book in the description for anyone who wants to hear more about them. I know I would. But for today's purposes, we are here to talk about one word that sort of tells us a lot about the French and how exacting they are, and that is this word compliqué. And I have a quote from you that I actually first discovered in a book on demystifying the French, where you said, to the French, something that is complicated is interesting, and it's worthy of respect, not impatience or disdain. And that seems pretty right on the nose. How would you sort of characterize the French relationship with things that they perceive as compliqué?
Well, to understand compliqué, you pretty much have to grasp that its opposite, simple, is fairly negative. Not always. And with much language, it depends on who's saying it and what tone they're saying it. But often simple is right up there with nice, and it's a deadly insult in French. These are both positive words in English, which is why Anglophones often misunderstand their intention in French. Keep in mind that I've learned much of my French in academia, where it's daggers drawn. So if someone described a colleague as simple, très gentil, the listener would understand that he was a complete idiot. You know, it's very clear in French, and it's the exact opposite as English. So compliqué takes the upper hand. And it can be weaponized as well when it's used to indicate that the matter at hand is far above your understanding. Or it can mean no. Or it can simply be, the French version of it's a long story, which it gets used as, I would say, most of the time. And so in that context, it's fairly neutral and not condescending.
Okay. Yeah, I think that sort of idea of like simplicity or even niceness is something that often gets talked about when we talk about Americans smiling a lot, and the French don't really smile at you as kind of a greeting. And when we smile as Americans, I think often we get pigeonholed as being simple. Like there's a simplicity to just being happy all the time, and the French kind of have this, I don't know, admiration for melancholy because it means you're thinking about something.
You're a serious person.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, France is kind of, if you want to describe it, it's like Baroque rather than Bauhaus. It's all full of complications and a very decorative surface and decorative way of dealing with people rather than simple and functional.
Right. And as a historian, I mean, do you have an idea as to why? I mean, I think as Americans, maybe our desire for our culture definitely could be compared to the UK in a lot of ways. But in France, historically, do you feel like there's a reason why this complication or convoluted nature kind of arose?
I have a theory.
Okay.
I have a theory, and it's that, in France, you have the culture of the monarchy, and you have the culture of the republic. And just because the monarchy is gone doesn't mean that the habit of the monarchy has disappeared. So with monarchy, you have a vertical social order. Status, power, privilege, all are stacked up. And I often use the image of Yertle the turtle, all the turtles stacked up like that. Class is important. And all of that is in a very vertical order. But then you have the republic, which begins with equality, égalité. And that is presumably horizontal. American society tends to be horizontal. You can speak to anyone. There's no kind of order in which you should not address this person because they're above you, right? But in France, you have this conflict between the verticality and the horizontality, if I can put it that way. Everybody, when two people meet who don't know each other, two French people, they will immediately start sussing out whether someone is above or below them on the social ladder. And the vouvoiement is part of that. And they'll exchange subtle clues in order to adjust into position. You'll hear a lot of moi je when this is going on. And it's necessarily a complicated choreography because at the same time, they're avowing equality as a republic, but the power and privilege is still vertical. While there's this equality, there's this social verticality, and the conflict of that is necessarily kind of a complicated situation.
Now, I find that fascinating too, because this that social verticality. I mean, obviously, with the two different forms of you, the tu and the vous, as you talked about, we're definitely constantly kind of situating ourselves in relation to other people and trying to decide if we're on the same playing field or not. That said, as Americans, I think one thing that surprises people a lot is that the French don't really talk about what they do in terms of work the first time they meet each other. And I always got the impression that that was because they were trying to cultivate that sense of equality. But if it is indeed this sort of vertically stacked society, how do you kind of understand that, the fact that the French don't really want to talk about what they do in the way that Americans do as like a status symbol?
Yeah, well, the French identity is not tied to work. You may have noticed this. Whereas in the United States, it's very much tied to work. So in France, your identity is a social identity, and it is based on, again, class, power, privilege. Where are you from? What did your parents do? They won't ask you that. You'll tell that in small details of where you went to school, the way you phrase things. It's much less than in Britain, where the way you speak tells everything about your class. So there's much less of that in France, but it still is there. And it's really subtle. And some people don't care about it, and they won't kind of impose their social position on others, but others will. So, it's always an interesting game when you meet people, how they're going to play it. As Americans, we are not in the game. We do not sit on the ladder. We're completely out of this whole thing. So we're observers. And for me, that's a wonderful position to be in because it doesn't matter. So as a neutral party to this exchange and this positioning, you can be wherever you want and be whoever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting to see that, it is, like you said, like a game. You're sort of trying to pick up context clues to see where someone else is from and what they're about, instead of just being able to be direct the way that Americans are. I think that, it's to be direct in France is often kind of uncouth. It's all about playing that game. So it's super interesting to watch, definitely as an outsider, as you say. Now, also as outsiders, of course, we do come face to face with complications in France. And one of the most frequent times that you hear c'est compliqué as a foreigner is when you're dealing with that infamous bureaucracy. So things like, if you go to the post office in France, you can't buy an envelope without a stamp on it. You have to go buy that somewhere else and then bring it to the post office, or like a plain box for shipping. Or if you go to the prefecture and you want to get a timbre fiscal, which is like a special stamp to send in your residence card application, you didn't used to be able to buy the timbre fiscal at the prefecture. You had to buy it somewhere else. So why do you think that there's so much of this like bureaucratic, this is the wrong form, go here. No, you have to go. I mean, there's a famous even Asterix and Obelix cartoon about how crazy it is to like run up and down different halls to get to different places to sort of fill out all of these little bits and pieces that you need to do. Why do you think that's so complicated here?
Well, I often joke that 90% of the responses to any question I pose are, "But no, madame," because everything you ask is always, "But no, madame, you can't do this. You must go there. You must do this." And the reasons will differ, but sometimes it's just an invitation to test your mettle, because if you can't figure it out, if you can't assemble the pieces, persuade the official, then you don't deserve to complete your mission. In France, no often means convince me. While in the States, no means no. I got pulled over by some policemen, earlier today, and I went straight into the apology, the you are so right, I am so wrong, and that was really important. And I didn't get a ticket, and it's because I agreed with them. They had the upper hand. They were right. It's a question kind of assuming the position that's socially correct for that exchange. And that's kind of away from what you were talking about with the complications of interactions and just getting things done. For things like the timbre fiscal, I think it's a question of spreading the wealth, because you could only buy a timbre fiscal at a tabac, or maybe somewhere else too, but the tabac was where you went. So that gave some business to the tabac of the neighborhood little supply place. So there's a little bit of spreading the wealth around that makes things a little more complicated. But again, there's just this passion for making things a little more difficult.
Yeah. And what you said about testing your mettle, that definitely resonated with me, because I went to French University, and French University, at least when I went for foreigners, it was free, but it was all about, assembling the right documentation to show that you could go. And it was like, you need this and you need that, and you come to this office. Ah, non, madame, it's exceptionally closed, which is always my favorite expression, exceptionnellement fermé. Everything is always exceptionally closed today. And so, come back. Oh no, the person you wanted to talk to is not here. You have to come back again. And it's almost like, if you make your way through this convoluted maze of bureaucratic stopping points, you've earned the right to then enroll in school, which it's definitely probably still poorly seen, but in America, I feel like you can pay your way to the front of most lines, and in France, you definitely can't.
Yeah, and if you try, you will be so, so sorry.
Yeah.
I often tell this to my students that, money solves problems in the States. If a problem can be solved with money, it will be, but in France, the problem is far, far more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
I was resident director for the Paris Exchange Program of City University of New York for many years. And one of the first things I told arriving students was this: in New York, you start your day, you say, I'm going to do this or that. In Paris, you say, I'm going to try to do this or that. If you don't succeed, it's not a failure. You did try, because getting something done is hardly ever happens on the first go.
Oh my gosh. I remember that when I first moved here, I was living in Cannes, and I remember standing in the line at the post office to buy stamps. And the two women behind the counter were just like chatting away, living their lives. And it came to 12:30, and they were like, all right, the post office is closed. And, I feel like in New York, if you'd been standing in line when the post office closes, like they'll serve you and then they won't let anyone else in. But they were like, no, come back after lunch. Like, so you're attempting, but you can't get it done. But yeah,
exactly.
Now, okay, so as an American, obviously, coming into this scenario, things like that, queuing for a long time and being kicked out, or things like, the person at the till at the grocery store wanting you to pay with exact change and getting huffy if you don't, or trying to return something. I mean, the convoluted attempt to return something that you bought and don't want anymore seems so unnecessarily complicated in France. But that obviously is coming from an American standpoint. Do you think that the French actually see all of these things as being complicated, or do you think that they're just so used to it that they don't even notice anymore?
Well, I think there's a totally different approach, and it's partly because we're Americans that we see things as complicated on that. There's a social choreography to public interaction that Americans miss a lot. And you mentioned Janet Hulstron's book, Demystifying the French, which I think she explains it very well in her book. You have to greet the shopkeeper properly. And it helps, like I was saying with the incident with the police, to show some deference, to put them above you on the ladder. Now, in the States, this would be just a simple commercial transaction where somebody represents the buyer, somebody represents the seller, and there's no social anything about it. But everything is personal in France. So these are people who have headaches and they're tired and it's time for lunch and they're not going to deal with you. Service is not the goal here, hardly ever. So you have to strategize to get waited on. You have to strategize to get your thing done when they're going to close for lunch. You beg. You throw yourself on their mercy and say, "Oh, madame, I can't come back. Please, can I?" And then they'll usually do it, but they make you beg. Yeah, and that's just a strategy. It's a social strategy.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Yeah, that social interaction part of it, like, definitely whenever I land at Charles de Gaulle Airport and you're waiting in passport control, and like the two agents will be sitting there like, and how was your vacation? And how's your grandmother? And how's this? And it's like, sir, can you just stamp my passport so I can move through? But like to be in a hurry, like they would take twice as long if you tried to hurry them along.
Exactly. The more you seem irritated, the longer they will take to wait on you.
Yep.
So you just smile, and then they'll wait on you.
Yeah, exactly.
But it means that you understand the game.
Exactly.
You're part of the game and you understand it and you're going to play your part. You're just going to sit there and smile at them. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my strategy. I don't know.
Oh, no, I definitely play the game. Definitely the deference part. I think I remember one thing I noticed when I started trying to navigate all of these bureaucratic situations, and a tip that I've given a lot of Americans out there is if you want something from a French bureaucrat, don't ask them for it. Tell them that it's impossible. So like you go to the front of the line and you're like, I know that you don't do this, and they'll try and prove you wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
Which kind of leads me into this. There's this expression in French that I heard when I first moved here, and I assumed that it was because my grasp of the language wasn't good enough that I didn't quite understand it. But I actually think it is kind of hard to grasp what it really means. And that is, impossible n'est pas français. So impossible is not French. And by that, it's sort of the indication is that impossible is not a word in French, which of course it is. But how do you understand this sort of idea that like, oh, to say something is impossible is impossible in French, with this fact that the French love telling you, as you said, no, or making things really complicated? I mean, what does that expression kind of mean to you?
Well, unfortunately, I'm seeing it on Twitter connected to Eric Zemmour. So I think I'm just going to sidestep that because I'm not really sure whether that was a meme or a joke or whether he's actually using it as a slogan, because I wouldn't put anything past him. But there's a better expression that actually kind of plays into this, and that is pourquoi faire simple quand on peut faire compliqué?
Oh, yeah.
And do you know that one?
Yes.
So I'm told that this is from a late 1960s television cartoon called Les Shadocks, who were apparently as silly as can be. I've never seen it. But they did offer some satire. So that was one of them. Pourquoi faire simple quand on peut faire compliqué? And, sometimes the result of all this complication is, and the Code de Travail is really a shining example, is total paralysis. Sometimes I kid around that that's the goal from the beginning, is to get to paralysis. You cannot do A because of B, and B cannot be changed because of C, which would then eliminate A. So rather than eliminate the obstacles, the French create them, and then they arrive at paralysis, and then no one can do anything.
Oh, yeah.
And that seems to be the goal sometimes. That also leads to another favorite quote, which is Il n'y a pas de problème dont l'absence de solution ne finisse pas par résoudre. There is no problem that the absence of a solution does not end by resolving.
Oh my God.
So once they get to paralysis, they don't have to work on the problem anymore. Parce que c'est pas possible. It's not impossible, but it's pas possible. So that's, it's kind of a snake eats tail thing, but they go around and then everyone is stuck.
Oh, it's a total snake eats tail thing. It's exactly like the when you first move here and you're trying to get an apartment and you can't get an apartment contract without a bank account, but you can't get a bank account without an address.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And like how many times have I been frustrated to tears because of it's like, well, you need this. Or the fact that you have to know they expect you to be able to prove a negative. Mm-hmm. Like I remember going into a bureaucratic office. I didn't have proof of Social Security, but I could prove that I'd been paying into the system. And they were like, oh, but you don't have a number. And I was like, but there's a number here. And they're like, oh, but that's not your number. I'm like, well, how am I supposed to know that? And they're like, Madame, you should have known. Like it's your responsibility to know that you don't have a number. How can one prove a negative?
Yeah, the bureaucracy is pretty much of a nightmare, and you can get stuck, and then it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, there is also this sense that that when you beat the system, when you finally come through on the other side and you have found the solution and you have done that gymnastics of working your way around all of these things, there is a sense of success and sort of pride that you can have that you've out-tricked the system.
Victory.
Exactly.
Oh yeah.
Now, I used to be told when I first moved here, when I would say, oh, it's complicated, and they would say, oh, it's not complicated, it's complex. Do you intuit a difference in French between compliqué and complexe?
Well, I'd say it's kind of a question of form. Compliqué is a gnarl of yarn, and complex is a palimpsest of layers, which can get into sort of intellectual analysis too. But compliqué is just things get tied up. And frankly, right now, the pandemic has added a really interesting layer of complexity. I wanted to just talk about that for a second, because on the one hand, the access to tests and vaccinations has been terrific and not complicated for the most part, okay? But in stores and institutions, attempts to reduce contact between people were often just ridiculous, And the New York Times ran an article about it in the spring, referring to the apotheosis of the absurd, which I thought was a perfect term for some of that. They covered up the dishes but not the pens, or the pillows but not the towels, and it was just, there was no logic could be found in all this. This tide of complications has receded a bit, although we may be heading back into it. Things are not looking good right now, but the paths that were drawn and the measures required have pretty much been removed with the rise in vaccinations. So it'll be so interesting to see what layer of complications they keep after the end of the pandemic, right? Because it has added this other layer. It's been the nec plus excusa, if I can say that, for almost 2 years. Why can't I do this? À cause de la pandémie. You can't do this, you can't do that. And that has been the excuse everyone has pulled out of their back pocket to stop anything from happening. So will France simplify afterwards, or will it keep the complications? I think that's something to keep an eye on for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think we've seen an interesting perception of logic in different places around the world, but definitely in France, where it's like, oh, you can do this, but you can't do that. Sometimes it seems almost randomly decided, which is kind of interesting.
Right. Well, I mean, you were asking about complications previously, and, the person at the top who's making the decisions is at the top because they've mastered more complication than anyone else. And so they have to put more complications from above going downwards on everyone. Otherwise, they won't be at the top. What's the point of being at the top if you can't abuse everyone below you? So all of these complications are drifting down from people, whether it's a store manager or the president. It's all coming down from the top, and it's not about efficiency for the most part. It's about, what can I make people do? So with the pandemic, we've kind of been at the mercy of some amazing decisions.
Yeah. And not necessarily just with regards to the pandemic, but if, as you say, with all of these different sort of top-down complications, if you, the lowly, person, can outsmart those complications, do you think that you get met with respect or annoyance? Like the fact that you were able to sort of solve this complicated puzzle, do the French respect that, or do they get annoyed by it?
Well, the context would probably determine that. But in general, I think there's respect for being able to either sidestep or resolve a complication. I tend to sidestep. It's just easier because you can't really confront a complication, with the way things go in this sort of thing. You can't confront it. It won't solve it. You need to either sidestep it or bring in someone who has more power than you. I don't know. It's tough though. Yeah.
Yeah. Or poke holes in all of the if A to B to C. If you poke holes in the logic, you can sometimes get somewhere, but sometimes that just gets you nowhere, saying, but that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, bah oui, mais c'est comme ça, madame.
Exactly. C'est normal. This is a word I have an absolute war with, the word normal. It means absolutely nothing, but they use it all the time to mean that it's ordinary, but normal is not, it's not normal.
Well, we might have to have you come back on to talk to us about normal, because that also points in the direction of normalement, which is my favorite qualifier. I mean, it's annoying, but normalement means if everything is aligned, this is what will happen. But I will not be punished if anything goes wrong and it doesn't happen.
Normalement means no. Normalement means it's not going to happen. Whenever someone starts a sentence with normalement, you know that whatever it is you want is not going to happen. So, get yourself ready for the big disappointment. Normalement, you can go here and do this, but not today. This is, yeah. So. But it's fun. I mean, living in France is such a challenge, and I just feel really lucky that I've been here about 30 years. My husband's French. My kids were born here. So, it gives you a sort of a sense of society. And I have a French passport, but I wouldn't say that I'm French because that's something that you have to grow up to be in many ways. I could live here. I've lived here longer than I ever lived in the States at this point, in fact. So it's a wonderful place to live. And the challenge is just, everywhere you live is going to be frustrating at some point. And I don't know, they don't bother me so much. You get used to it. You learn how to play the game, and it's all good.
Yeah, and it's kind of fun where, every interaction feels almost like a side quest in a video game, and you get these little victories all the time when you get someone to do something for you right off the bat. So, I mean, I've been here 13 years now, and I've had my French passport for 2 years, but like you, I mean, I will probably never be truly French, but it's still fun to try.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, Ellen. I have just one last question for you before we go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, wow. My favorite word. Of course, I'm drawing a complete blank. I mean, I could say plaisir, because you can use it in so many different ways. C'est un plaisir is always a fun thing to say, because it means you've done somebody a favor, or, it has very positive kind of connotations, and can be, so many French words, and this is true in English as well, but so many French words can be used in very different ways that they're fun to play with and get them right, which is also a challenge for a non-native speaker.
Totally, but a super fun one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, it has been a plaisir speaking with you, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.